Gaming on the brand new M1 MacBook Pro is much better than I expected. The major problem is that there aren't that many huge AAA titles that work natively on the M1 silicon. So this means a lot of games run really well, but until developers make native M1 versions, they may not exceed your expectations. The MacBook featured in this video is a 16-inch M1 Pro with a 10-core CPU, 16GB of RAM, and a 16-core GPU. I will be doing another video that will feature the M1 Max with the top GPU specs and 32GB of RAM, so make sure you subscribe to see that up-and-coming video. The first set of games I wanted to try were found on Steam. This included Counter-Strike, City Skylines, and also Rocket League. Currently at the moment, the Steam store has by far the most Mac OS supported games. Now, unfortunately, my first impressions of gaming on the MacBook were incredibly negative. I successfully installed CSGO, but whenever I would try and launch the game, it simply would not work. I would boot up CSGO to be presented with this ridiculous cutscene that was promoting some microtransactions within the store, and then beyond that point, the screen would just go black, and I would hear the main menu music, but could not select anything or interact with the game. So this was a complete fail, and I had to move on to the next game. For a bit of clarification, I am running the latest version of the macOS Monterey, which is 12.0.1, which I did update to with the hope that it would remove this issue with CSGO, but it simply didn't. I then moved on to City Skylines. I thought this would be a fantastic game to try out because it is quite dependent on CPU performance as well as GPU performance. I tried a range of different levels, including a small city versus a much larger city that I built many years ago in an older file. I chose to set the graphic settings as high as possible. I chose the highest resolution within the menu, and I also set everything to high. When I was building a city within a relatively new save, it was a very small town that I was building out, the performance definitely hovered around sort of 45 frames per second, and it was completely playable and very comfortable. I then went ahead and booted into a much more complicated city that was processing a lot more tasks. And even with all of the graphic settings as high as possible, I was still getting about 30 frames per second with 25 frames per second in the very busy areas. So considering the increase in level size, there wasn't that much of a drop-off within the performance. I was very happy with how City Skylines was playing, and if you wanted even more frames per second, you could easily drop down the resolution. You don't need to have it cranked as high as I did. The next game within Steam that I went on to try was Rocket League. Unfortunately, this is no longer supported on macOS for playing multiplayer. I could only play offline against bots, but the game overall is very well optimized, and I chose the highest graphical settings once again and was achieving about 85 frames per second. And for a fast-paced game like this, that is also very chaotic with beautiful graphics, the M1 Pro is doing a fantastic job. Even though the M1 Pro and M1 Max are definitely capable of running these games, I still would not recommend buying one of these laptops solely for playing games. And the main problem is you do not have access to the latest and greatest titles. So if you want to play very mainstream AAA titles like Grand Theft Auto 5, that simply is not possible on macOS because there's no build of the game from Rockstar that enables you to run this natively on a Mac. So you have to run external software like Parallel, which means you're running like a cracked version of the game within this sort of Windows emulator, and it's just a nightmare to set up, and you're not really truly getting the full potential of the M1 architecture. Now, this wouldn't be a game performance test if we didn't take a look at Fortnite. Me personally, I'm not a huge Fortnite player, but it does run incredibly well on this M1 Pro. I went ahead and chose the auto graphics settings. This allows Fortnite to figure out what are the optimal settings for your particular system, and Fortnite chose the high preset, which shows how serious this game is taking the M1 Pro's power. The only graphic setting I did change was from windowed to full screen. Choosing to run a game in full screen mode over windowed does give it a little bit extra performance. Once I was into a match, the performance was comparable to a next generation console. I was hitting a steady 80 frames per second with lows of about 65 frames per second, and this was completely playable. Other than the lack of native support for AAA titles, there is one major area why I would never recommend buying this laptop to play video games on, and that is the ProMotion display. Firstly, the ProMotion display is adaptive, and you can only lock the frame rate to a maximum of 60 Hz. I understand from my knowledge that this adaptive display could cause issues with graphic settings such as VSync. Secondly, the ProMotion display isn't a very fast panel. Unlike many high refresh rate gaming monitors, the response time is incredibly low, usually 1 millisecond or 2 milliseconds at a push. And the ProMotion display definitely does not have this, and you're probably looking at something more like a 5 millisecond response time. And I think if you're seriously considering spending this amount of money on a computer to play games on, it would be more sensible to purchase something like a Razer Blade, which has a proper NVIDIA graphics card and can run AAA games natively. If you want to watch another video just like this, where I share my thoughts on gaming on an M1 iPad Pro, you're going to want to watch this video next.